I'm delighted to have my friend Joey Prasuti back during this Advent season to talk about the Incarnation of Jesus. Throughout our conversation, I was reminded that I'm severely lacking in communication skills, that I'm grateful to God for Joey's friendship, but of utmost importance, that the gospel is truly inexhaustible. May the conversation that is shared with you over these next few episodes be used to encourage you to increasingly revel in Jesus and all he is for us. From one disciple of Jesus to another. I will say, since we're rolling out, man, I've been excited and looking forward to this, and even our other conversation that Lord willing we'll have about a paper or thesis that you had written. And when we discuss this concept, it's just flowing well for the season with Advent. And a previous podcast I talked a little bit about the Hoshek, the darkness, Christ coming into the darkness, Jesus being the light of the world. Everything was centered around John 1. And I'll use the word coincidentally, but it's been encouraging because my pastor has also been spending the last two services in John chapter 1, which is different than most Advent times. And so as we look at the Incarnation, it's something that I think is the word I'm looking for is it's woven into the story, but I don't think it's really thought about. Like baby Jesus is cute, right? Sort of like Talladega Nights. Like I like to think of sweet baby Jesus. We like to think of that, but we don't necessarily think too hard about the implications of the Incarnation for us. And so when you brought that up, I was excited, like to discuss it, hear your thoughts on it, and kind of see where this goes. So in John 1 will be the kickoff verse. But of course, whatever thoughts you have, moving to Philippians perhaps maybe the groundwork of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Man, there's so many different ways to approach it. I think so. Let's put ourselves into John chapter 1 for a moment, as the Apostle John's writing this. He's writing this obviously in light of the Easter story. He's in light of an empty tomb, in light of the resurrected Jesus now ascended to heaven, and now he's writing his gospel account. And it's interesting that John doesn't start there, because that's not, the gospel doesn't start at Easter, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't even start at It doesn't start at Christmas. He goes back, and the first three words of John 1:1 is in the beginning.
Yeah.
And any Greek Jew would have known in the beginning, would have triggered in their head. It would have been a trigger alert. They would have gone back to Genesis 1:1. And so what John does, and this is so easy to miss during this Advent season and every Advent season, is that there is no Easter without the Christmas story. But that Christmas story far predates 4 BC, or whenever the scholars ultimately agree on what that date is. It dates in eternity past, right, when there's this incredible relationship with the Father and the Son. And so John takes us all the way back. In the beginning was the Word. And so I think that means that there's creation implications. So this is a creation story. And that's really what the story of Easter, or story of Christmas, is all about. And as you're reading this, it's almost a story of humanity, right? So if you're a normal Gentile or Jew, or just a normal average everyday person, when Jesus is born, you're born in a world of, if you're a Jew, you're oppressed by the Romans. If you're a Gentile, you're clinging to your idols, to your Roman emperor worship. You're living after sin and in sin, and the world is incredibly dark. And so in that moment, we found out pretty easily humanity is not its savior. It needs something else, someone else. And in that moment, John kind of brings us into the good news, his gospel according to John, the good news according to John, which goes back to humanity needs to be fixed. So we have to go all the way back to, again, creation. So I think there's so many elements that when we talk about the Christmas story, it's just like we're barely even touching the tip of the iceberg when we talk about Jesus being born, right? There's so many reasons as to why, in the context of when and how he was born, right? Conceived by the Holy Spirit in Mary's womb, and how these things all interplay. But I also think, and this is something we've talked about as well, is that the context, and we'll get to that, I think, more in detail, but the incarnation, the God becoming flesh, that's what that means, incarnating, becoming one of us, human beings, it has so much implication. And it becomes the theological tool used by the writers of the New Testament as to how to dictate how we live, right? We are called to live like just what he did. And so it's Christmas is not just a cute story; it's a way of living, right? It's finding yourself always. And so we can get into that when Paul talks about, he essentially goes back to the incarnation and uses this to some extent, this theology. But no, man, I just think there's a lot of implications that we miss. And yeah, I hope to delve into that because I really think that has more power than the emptiness of a tomb means nothing if the manger wasn't full, right? Just think of that.
Yeah.
Like we talk so much about an empty tomb, but there had to be a full manger at some point, right? Like God had to come and dwell physical space and then leave that space. And so that beautiful harmony of that story, I just think has so much implications for my everyday life and as well as anybody else.
So yeah, I do want to get into the implications of the incarnation. I like the empty tomb only has meaning because the manger was full. I think that's a good way to remember the importance of the birth of Christ. But you also said some things about creation and John 1 tying back to Genesis. So can we hover there for just a second? Because
yeah, let's do it.
I think I've been spending time in Genesis the last, I don't know, month or so, right? And especially it helps with some of the Hebrew stuff that I'm trying to learn, and I see in the beginning as the trigger for creation. And you have a lot of the same things when you mentioned the Spirit was instrumental in the conception of Christ. You have him being born in flesh. So can you unpack that a little bit more? Like how much of the creation, or I almost see recreation, but you can tweak that of recreation, would you see in the first 5-6 verses of John, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you read Genesis 1:1, notice the language is very clear. God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form or void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, right? So John he's taking language in Genesis 1 and saying there's also darkness in the world. That darkness is due to sin, right? In Genesis 1, there is no darkness due to sin because sin enters in Genesis 3. And so you can see John paralleling these two different worlds. And what he's essentially saying, there is a recreation happening in the sense of how to recreate man, how to do a regenesis, a new Genesis. And that can only happen through and because of the incarnation of this God who becomes flesh, who becomes man. And so and obviously the Spirit's involved there because the Spirit's hovering over, which is one of the agents of creation, right? It is the third person of the Trinity creating as well. And it's also the very thing that the Spirit conceives Christ in the womb of Mary. Creating the virgin birth. So there's light language in Genesis 1. So I think what John is intentionally trying to do, he's trying to present a recreation story of saying all of the brokenness and all of the sin that has left us, we now have to go back to the beginning to have a new beginning, and that new beginning becomes this person who's taken on human flesh, which is Christ. And so I think that there's no coincidence to John and to his reader who would have read this that would have seen that this is all tying into the creation of the world now as the birth of the creator of the world, so to speak, who's come to redeem it.
Okay. So with that, I guess I'm trying to see how this understanding of John would also reframe Christmas. So Christmas,
sure.
What I think I hear you saying is it's a celebration of creation, new creation, recreation, more than the typical idea that I would have of Christmas up until the recent past was, yeah, there's joy, you give gifts, right? Everything is happy, Mele Kalikimaka is even awesome, right? So everything that you hear is just this fluffy, feel good, joyous time of year. But Christmas is really about not just a new world that will come, but a new world that is here in a sense that will come in its fullness. And to harken back to the tomb and the manger, the idea is Jesus is the newly created humanity, if I'm phrasing that correctly. The
Yeah.
reinstatement of, well, not just reinstatement, because I think it's he's taken humanity up a notch, right? So he's the new Adam, but he's so much more than the first Adam, right?
Right. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Paul even talks about that, right? He expresses that there's, in essence, there's a new humanity in and through because of Christ. I mean, he's the new Adam. I mean, that's all tied um, together. I think you're dead on there for sure in saying all that. Yeah.
Okay. So with creation Christmas, I'll go with I guess the
Well,
lead
let
in.
me add one thing. Let me
Yeah,
add
yeah,
one more
yeah, yeah.
thing. I think this is where the danger of our culture and the danger of Gnosticism would have been for John's time, right? Gnosticism had the belief that matter was evil. And John, who writes in First John as well against Gnosticism,
Mm-hmm.
and especially Docetism as well, one of the big heresies
So
within those two different.
you want to explain
Yeah,
Docetism too?
sure. So Docetism was the heresy in the early church where it did not believe that Jesus was actually flesh, which goes right into the incarnation, right? It's the whole point of Christmas, and that Jesus essentially appeared as a spirit. That's kind of what Docetism means in the Greek. It's just that he's appearing as a spirit, it's like a ghostly like figure. And a lot of that's rooted in the idea that matter is evil. And so if matter is evil, humanity, a physical being is evil by its own nature. What Christmas actually means is that while humanity is broken, it's not discardable, right? And those are two different things.
Yeah.
Docetism believed humanity is evil and therefore get rid of it. It's not good in of itself. And that goes against Genesis 1 and 2, which every day is good. There's nothing intrinsically wrong or non-valuable about the human being. What it is that sin has broken that. And Jesus has come to restore that. And so the fact that God becomes flesh doesn't mean that you don't have hope. It means that you actually have more hope than ever because what was broken has now been fixed. So your body isn't unlovable or unlikable or unwantable. That God is actually reaffirming his creation, reaffirming humanity. Why? Because he becomes one, right? He could have become something entirely different. He could have become an alien if he wanted to. But I think if he did anything else, that would say to us, there's something wrong with us. Like God made us physical human beings, and here we are, he messed up. But he's not saying that. The fact that God becomes flesh is reaffirming his creation. But the fact that he had to come was to fix the underlying issue with creation, which is sin. So I think getting back to it, the incarnation is an affirmation of human value, of human dignity, of the sanctity of life to an extent, right? Like we are imago Dei. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with us by our design. But what's cracked or broken or twisted us is this thing called sin. And that's the one thing that's different. That Jesus becoming Adam reaffirms all those who are in the Adamic line, all those who are human, but it also that he's Adam means that he is the Adam before Adam sins, which is why he never sins, representing all of the humanity. So by faith in him, right, we now become part of that new humanity. So anyways, there's more creation language there, right? Again, it's going back to creating the new humanity, but it's also, man, it's so important because it's affirming human dignity, right? I think we live in a culture now, this goes to implications, but when we are saying that human beings have value, we're not saying that they're perfect. We're not saying that they have value because they're flawless, but they have value because there's something on them or in them that is not on anything else that God created, which is the imago, the image of God. And so Jesus' own the Son becoming incarnate and becoming flesh, it's just an affirmation of that. It just reaffirms to my kids, right, to your kids, that they're sinful, but they're beautiful in God's eyes. They're worthy of salvation. The rescuer came to save them, to look like them, to be them, and all those things. So
yeah, that's helpful too with Docetism as you're speaking. I think it could still be in our culture, at least
for sure.
I'll say at least in my Southern Bible Belt culture. It's easy for us to separate, and I remember again. My dad's always he's always exemplified Christ in me as best he possibly could. But we've had conversations growing up where, he would ask me questions. If I chop both your arms and your legs off, right? Like, are you still Daniel? Well, yeah, I'm still Daniel, right? And so, and he doesn't necessarily hold to this view now, but it was his attempt at explaining the real Daniel is on the inside. So, and then it became my understanding, well, God saves whatever this ghosty blob thing is on the inside, and then my body's like a Tupperware container that's spaghetti stained, right? It just goes in the trash. And for a long time, I was I guess a Docetist, maybe, if I'm saying it right. Like,
you didn't even know it.
I didn't even know it until I remember reading N.T. Wright, where he said, I think I've said it many times, I love it, it's one of my favorite quotes of his. Well, one of my favorite quotes of his, by the way, just a sidetrack, is 20% of everything I say is wrong. I just don't know which 20% it is. Like, I think that's a good one. It's a humble quote. But
that's a good one.
The other thing he said is, heaven is great, but it's not the end of the world. Right. And when he said it, I was like, whoa, now hold up. That sounds heretical. And then continued to read. I understood what he meant was God is redeeming the physical world. Like, there's a new heaven and a new earth. And what you're saying is the incarnation is him forever joining himself to part of his creation, unlike any other part, not even Elohim, like angels, angelic beings, or spirit beings. He didn't become somehow like one of them, or an alien. Like, he didn't become anything but a man. And now that's forever, right? It's undoable. So he has put a stake in the ground. Like, he has literally redeemed the physical creation through that. And I think it's important because it's easy to be so heavenly minded. I'll air quotes, right? So heavenly minded and not earthly good, in the sense that I think that's Docetism, right? If you're saying heavenly is spiritual type. So
without any physical components, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the classic thing is, if you were to be asked right now, what does Jesus look like? And in their mind, it's this spiritual ghost that's in the sky. And I would tell you, by believing that, one, you're rejecting the gospel. Two, what you're rejecting is the value of your own human dignity. Because the fact that he is physically Jesus Christ, a human being out of Nazareth, right, born, but who is also God, and God incarnate in heaven, the fact that those things are true reaffirms that there's so many different layers of that we'll get to later about the implications of how that matters to me on a physical level, but it also matters because it's not that, again, God didn't discard his flesh. He didn't remove it. And if anything, the incarnation, God becoming flesh, is almost an already not yet feature, in which I'll explain this, and you know this all too well, but already not yet is the kind of eschatological view that the scriptures teach consistently, that there's a sense right now that when Christ came, it's as if heaven is invading earth. So there's a sense of God's future glory, future presence, future promises are already invading right now earth, and we're getting the benefits of the future, but not the complete package. And so already we're getting the benefits of the eschatological future, the future end times, end world, if you will, those future blessings of restoration, resurrection, but in a spiritual component. But there awaits a physical component as well. And so the fact that God dwells amongst us is, in some sense, physically for a time, they got that, but we get to spiritually be a part of that, which was denied for so long before. Now we get that every day, all day, right? Because Christ dwells within us. And so that's just a foretaste of what's to come, when we will get to be with him physically in our own physical bodies that are redeemed. The curse of sins are broken, and all those things are happening. So again, there's another component there, right? I've actually just never even thought about how the incarnation is really a foretaste of future glory. And how we get to partake of that now through the Holy, like John 14:15, right? How we get to be dwelling with him because of the Holy Spirit. That is, we get a little bit of that benefit right now until he comes again.
Thank you for listening. In following episodes, Joey and I continue to discuss the incarnation of Jesus and the practical implications this truth has for us. I hope you'll join us. Until then, shalom.